In recent years, it's become all too easy to criticize WWE for its bad booking. After all, with them botching what appeared to be some easy home runs during situations such as the Summer of Punk, the WWE debut of Sting, or numerous NXT call-ups over the years, many were left to wonder if Vince McMahon hadn't lost his touch. But he wasn't always that way, of course, because in a prior era, he was able to make creative decisions better than anyone else in the industry. And even in his latter days, he could still put out the odd gem here and there too. But what are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly why we're here today. So join us as we take a deep dive into right on the money WWE's best booking decisions. And if we're starting anywhere, we may as well start with the one which catapulted wrestling into the mainstream, and that's the decision to go with Hulk Hogan as the top guy in 1984. Yes, Vince McMahon always had plans of going national with WWF after taking over control of it from his father. But if he didn't have the right face to helm his campaign, it may have never worked. And that's why it was so crucial then that, while scouting the territories for the best talent to poach, he'd come across a young Terry Bollea in the American Wrestling Association. And with Bollea by then already having come up with the idea for Hulkamania, McMahon realized that all he had to do was get this seen by a larger audience, something he hoped to do by making Hogan his top guy and world champion. Then, once that was done, the next step would be to have the Hulkster shine on the grand stage, as by 1984, the boss had decided to go all or nothing by putting on the first ever WrestleMania. Of course, what really put this one over the top was the fact that Hogan wasn't alone out there that night. No, he had a tag team partner in the form of Mr. T, one of the most famous men on the planet at that time. So with this giving him the rub and WrestleMania proving to be a huge success, the era of Hulkamania would begin in full here, as Hogan became a pop culture phenomenon and a bona fide 80s icon. And the more famous his top star got, the more Vince McMahon was able to reap the rewards of this, as throughout the decade, WWF reached heights of popularity wrestling had never seen before. Yes, not only had he successfully killed the territories and made his company effectively the only game in town for someone who wanted national exposure, he'd also been able to take his idea of sports entertainment worldwide and turn it into the powerhouse as we all know it today. That said, the future of the company wouldn't be without its dark periods, with arguably the darkest of these coming during the mid-90s. And that was largely because, with the steroid trial damaging their public image and World Championship Wrestling poaching away many of their top talents, WWF was at one point in danger of going out of business. So luckily they found a new face to take them into the next era at this point, and the booking decision which finally sent this figure into the next stratosphere happened at WrestleMania 13 during the double turn of Steve Austin and Bret Hart. Now, full disclosure, in our opinion, this may be the greatest wrestling match of all time, so it's hard to not sound biased on this one. But that aside, the finish Vince McMahon came up with here is an example of why people used to consider him a genius. On one hand, you had the perennial babyface, Hart, someone who had always tried to do the right thing by fans, but who was now being turned on by a section of the audience who were hungry for something new. On the other hand, you had that something new, and his name was Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, Austin was supposed to be the heel in this situation, but with the late 90s audience taking to his anti-authoritarian ways, he'd get more and more cheers as the weeks went on. So, wisely choosing not to fight the fans anymore, the boss would quickly decide to have the two battle it out at WrestleMania 13 in an I Quit match, with his intention here being to execute a double switch in alignment before all was said and done. And the way he pulled this off was to have the rattlesnake gushing blood from the forehead and locked in the sharpshooter as the match was coming to a close. But with him still refusing to give up at this point, he'd end up passing out, causing Hart to be deemed the winner. Of course, after the bout was over though, the Hitman would decide he hadn't had enough yet, and so he'd continue to beat down on his opponent, with this decision finally turning him full heel in the eyes of fans. And after that, while he was leaving, Austin would get back up and walk out on his own 2 feet, safe in the knowledge that he'd never given up and was now fully in position to be the great anti-hero of his time. From there then, it was off to the races as the second boom period, the Attitude Era, would take wrestling mainstream once more. And had it not been for McMahon's decision to go with Austin as his next top guy that night, the whole thing might never have happened. But sometimes it's not turning someone babyface which proves to be the right booking decision at a given moment. No, sometimes you have a babyface who fans aren't getting behind, and what you really need to do is bite the bullet and turn them heel instead. And while by the point we got to 2020, Vince McMahon had been criticized for a long time for not doing this with Roman Reigns, in the summer of this year, he'd prove he still had it in him to make the right decision whenever he had to. Yes, after 6 years of being loudly rejected by fans who had no interest in seeing him be their new hero, Reigns would finally get to show off what he had to offer when he turned to the dark side at August 23rd SummerSlam. There, aligning himself with his wise man Paul Heyman and becoming the new Universal Champion. And what an excellent decision this turned out to be, because now no longer having to try to pander to audiences with the cheesy dialogue WWE's writing team had written for him, the Tribal Chief could let all his talent and charisma loose. This then would see him become arguably the best character in all of wrestling over the months which followed. As now fully playing up to his Samoan heritage, he'd gather his family around him in the form of the Bloodline, a stable which pretty much runs both SmackDown and Raw as of the time of this video's recording. That's right, not only is Reigns the Universal Champion on SmackDown, but he's now the WWE Champion on Raw too, making him the undisputed top dog wherever he goes. And further proving his dominance, his cousins the Usos have also won both the Red and Blue brands tag team titles, all while the rest of the stable has been rounded out with new recruits in the form of Solo Sikoa and honorary Uso Sami Zayn. Had the decision to turn Roman heel never happened then, it's likely we wouldn't have the best stable WWE has seen in years, and that he'd probably still be getting X-Pac heat wherever he went. But this wouldn't be the last time Vince McMahon made a great booking decision, because mere months before he was ousted from his position as the company's CEO, he'd nail it with the return of Cody Rhodes. And this one was particularly important because, with Rhodes being the first major defection from All Elite Wrestling, the way he was booked would send a clear message to any other performers who might have been thinking about switching sides when their contracts ran out too. Luckily for WWE then, McMahon wouldn't do here what he'd done with Dusty Rhodes years prior. No, this time there would be no polka dots in sight, just a star-making re-debut for Cody at WrestleMania 38, where he had an excellent match with Seth Rollins and came out of the night looking like a true superstar. Then after that, he'd have 2 more great bouts with the Architect, the latter of which fully solidified his main event status forever as, in one of the most insane and gruesome sights in recent memory, he chose to work a Hell in a Cell match with a pectoral muscle which was completely torn off the bone. But while the pain for this one must have been unimaginable, the benefits will likely be huge, as despite Vince McMahon now no longer being in charge, the way he booked the grandson of a plumber upon his return has meant that he's a shoo-in to come back an even bigger star than before, and likely be the one to finally dethrone Roman Reigns. Yes, even when he was on his final days, the boss could still show some glimmers of the old him whenever he needed to. But then, this was always clear even throughout his darkest days, because in 2014, right at the point where people were being more critical of him than ever following the debacle of the way he'd handled Daniel Bryan, he'd make a great decision when he chose to break up the Shield right at their peak. And while we understand that some will think this was a bad decision given that there was still more juice to be had in a babyface Shield run, we're going to argue it was a positive to break them off right when they were at their strongest. And the reason for this is that, as any writer will tell you, it's always better to leave things on a high instead of letting them get to the point where no one wants to see it anymore. So by having Rollins turn on his brothers on the June 2nd episode of Raw that year and severing arguably the most popular stable in the company at the time, it was ensured that they'd never get to the point where people were tired of seeing them. Think of what had happened with the NWO towards the end, or the way the constant DX reunions feel that much staler each time. Hell, you could even look at how watered down the Bullet Club has become in recent years if you want an example of why sometimes it's better to leave things be before they get beyond the point of no return. Yes, the Shield would have a couple of short-lived reunions after their breakup, but the fact that they ended on such a high has meant that these will always feel welcome. And it's not just about the legacy of what they had, of course, because breaking them off when he did allowed Vince to make all 3 into legitimate main eventers, with things now getting to a point where Roman Reigns is the king of WWE, Jon Moxley is the ace of AEW, and Seth Rollins arguably holds the position of best wrestler in either company. That said, for as much as it worked here, sometimes breaking up a stable is not the best way to get someone over to the next level. No, sometimes when a performer has all the raw talent in the world but needs a little help pulling it all together, the best place to put him is in a stable, as was the case with Rocky Maivia when he joined the Nation of Domination in 1997. Now, for younger fans who are only familiar with The Rock as he is now, it's hard to imagine, but there was a time where crowds actively hated the Great One. And the reason for this was because, when he first appeared on TV, he was portrayed as a pretty flat, smiling babyface who had all the personality of a piece of cardboard. Not that it was his fault though, as it was just the way the company chose to book him at the time. Still, they would be redeemed for this decision when, upon seeing the level of disdain fans had for their newest up-and-coming star, they decided to switch things up and have him turn heel instead by joining the Nation. And what a great decision this turned out to be, because now, without having to worry about being the babyface anymore, Rocky was able to let his cocky persona come to the forefront, as over the next few months, he gradually morphed into The Rock. Yes, this was the point where his verbal skills truly got a chance to shine for the first time, something which caused fans to fall in love with him even if by then he was still supposed to be the heel. But like with Steve Austin elsewhere on the show, this heel run was always going to have an expiration date on it because after proving himself to be too entertaining to boo, WWE would finally have shifted him back over to the position they always wanted him to be in by the time 1999 rolled around. And this would see him then go on to become the most electrifying man in sports entertainment and a bona fide megastar, with his success and overness only being topped by the Rattlesnake himself. But even Austin wouldn't be able to break into the mainstream the way Rocky did, as, in the years following this, he'd start a run in Hollywood, a run which would eventually see him become the biggest box office draw in the world. Of course, all this success can be traced back to that one decision to have him join the Nation in 1997, leaving us to wonder just how different the world might have been had he not been booked to do so. And another similar what-if would happen a few years later after this too, because, as we all know now, once The Rock and Steve Austin left WWE, the baton was picked up by none other than John Cena. That said, he was also struggling to get over during his early days on the roster, and at one point was almost fired outright. What saved him in the end then? Well, it was the decision to have him take up a hip-hop gimmick. Well, while Vince McMahon may have had the final say on whether this one went ahead or not, he was actually not the person to come up with the idea. No, it was actually Stephanie McMahon who proposed this to Cena after seeing him rapping with his colleagues on a tour bus. So pushing him to try this out on TV, then he'd first do so on the October 31st, 2002 episode of SmackDown where, donning a Vanilla Ice Halloween costume, he'd take to dropping some bars on the rest of the roster. And this would prove to be so popular that it soon became Cena's full-time gimmick, with him here morphing into the Doctor of Thugonomics, a cocky heel who could out-talk anyone on the mic. Of course, if this sounds familiar to the trajectory of The Rock, it should, because like Dwayne Johnson, John Cena would also find his career skyrocketing at this point. Yes, now no longer on the bubble of being released, he'd grow in confidence each and every week, eventually growing so popular that Vince McMahon decided to go with him as the new face of his company, ahead of others like Dave Bautista and Randy Orton. And the rest is history, because once his position as the next top guy was secured, Big Match John would go on a run which lasted almost 2 full decades and saw him achieve just about everything anyone could achieve in the ring. Sure, after he dropped the Doctor of Thugonomics gimmick and morphed into a more family-friendly babyface, his popularity was never the same with certain sections of the fan base. But by then, his run as rapping wrestler had established him enough to where, in kids' eyes, none of this was important and he would always be their hero no matter what. And giving John Cena a rapping gimmick wasn't the only great booking decision WWE made in 2002 as it happened, because around the same time they were doing this, they were also making the very necessary decision to execute the first ever brand split. Yes, by 2002, with the influx of WCW and ECW wrestlers who had recently joined the roster, it became impossible for everyone to get TV time, and so a number of very talented performers were constantly in danger of getting lost in the shuffle. So recognizing this, Vince McMahon would come up with a plan to deal with the situation by splitting his roster in two that spring, with half being exclusive to Raw and the other half being exclusive to SmackDown. And while this did mean fans would no longer get to see their favorite superstars multiple times a week, it also meant that, with there being more TV time available as a result of this, other performers got a chance to shine. That's right, in the first couple of years of the brand split alone, we'd see the likes of Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Booker T, Rob Van Dam, Edge, and Randy Orton all be elevated to the next level as a whole new host of stars got a chance to show what they could do. On top of that, in the years following this, the brand extension would allow both Batista and John Cena to rise to the forefront as main event talents by virtue of them being on separate shows. And while sure, at times the whole separate rosters thing wasn't booked brilliantly by WWE, the very fact that it was there would always allow for opportunities which wouldn't have arisen otherwise. Really, you could argue that without the introduction of it in 2002, WWE would be a far different place today, and that many of the guys we now consider legends might never have gotten to that point. Of course, if we're talking about legends getting a chance to blossom, however, we can't ignore the excellent booking decision which was made back in 1992 when Shawn Michaels split from his longtime partner, Marty Jannetty. That's right, it was in January of this year when a now famous segment aired which saw HBK turning his back on his partner by super kicking him and throwing him through the glass window of Brutus Beefcake's barbershop. And the reason this one turned out to be an excellent booking decision would be obvious. It set Michaels on a course that would lead him towards becoming arguably the greatest in-ring wrestler of all time. Sure, he was great before that, but in Vince McMahon's WWF, there was always going to be a glass ceiling for any tag team act, no matter how talented they were. So while HBK would find much success as part of the Rockers between 1988 and 1992, it wouldn't be until he broke away from Marty that his career really hit the next level. Of course, what made this moment even better for him in the long run was that, instead of having him be the babyface in the situation, the decision was made to turn Shawn heel and have him play the arrogant and cocky villain from there. And given the fact that at this point in his life he was pretty much a real-life heel, the role fit the Texas native perfectly and allowed him to let all of his personality finally shine. From there, he'd spend the rest of the 90s rising up the card to the point where he'd become a multiple-time WWF champion. And even when a back injury forced him to temporarily retire in 1998, he'd eventually be able to come back and have an arguably better second run in the 2000s, putting on classic after classic here, and at one point even giving fans what many believe to be the greatest match of all time against The Undertaker at WrestleMania 25. As for Marty Jannetty, though, his run following the Rockers split wouldn't be quite as successful, because his drug issues would prove to be so bad he could never keep his job for long enough to gain any momentum. And while this is sad for him, it doesn't change the fact that, as a result of his fall, another star was able to shine so brightly that few, if any, have ever been able to burn that hard again. Of course, as we know though, in the mid-90s WWF, there were two people who were vying for the position of GOAT, and while in many people's opinions, Shawn Michaels certainly had the stronger claim to this, many others feel that he was living in the shadow of Bret Hart. And part of the reason for this was because Bret had gotten so over himself when, in one of Vince McMahon's best booking decisions of the New Generation era, he'd choose to fix his mistake from the year prior and crown the Hitman at WrestleMania 10. Yes, while he may have suffered a setback when he lost to Yokozuna at Mania 9, then got punked out by Hulk Hogan after the fact, Hart was so good that even this wasn't going to keep him down for long. That said, even if he remained the clear favorite for fans at this time, Vince McMahon had already begun making plans to push Lex Luger as his next top guy then, something he felt he needed to do in the wake of the Hulkster leaving the company altogether. But as the months went on and it became clear Lex wasn't connecting with fans in ways WWF had hoped he might, the boss was left with a decision to make: fight the audience and push the guy he wanted down their throats, or go with them and give the ball to the Hitman instead. Luckily for everyone then, he would ultimately choose the latter, and so at WrestleMania 10, in front of a packed Madison Square Garden crowd in March of 1994, Bret would get his win back over Yokozuna, doing exactly what Luger had failed to do earlier in the night. Yes, there was a time when Vince McMahon listened to his fans and gave them what they wanted, and whenever he did this, it almost always resulted in a great response. So never let it be said again that he didn't know what he was doing in regards to storytelling then, because when he did put his mind to it, the boss and his company were able to make some of the best booking decisions in wrestling history.